So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sergio Caltadroni. I'm the Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Welcome to part one of our ICS OT 2021 Cybersecurity Year in Review webinar. This is about the threat landscape. We're going to be having two additional webinars. This is the first of three. We're going to be having another webinar March 16th. Focused on vulnerabilities in the industrial control space. And we're also going to have another webinar March 31st on lessons learned from the front lines. Basically our threat operations center and our professional services team and what they've learned through incident response, assessments and tabletops throughout the industrial control community. So that's really fascinating to hear about not just what's affecting not just what threats and vulnerabilities are affecting the industrial control space, but also how people are addressing it and what we're seeing the community do and where there are gaps. So again, I'm Sergio Caltadroni, Vice President of Threat Intelligence. We're excited to have you here. A few housekeeping items before we begin. The session is being recorded and the recording will be available after the webinar. All of your lines have been muted. But if you want to interact with us or ask questions, please do. I'm standing by. So the entire webinar, I'll be answering questions. Just go ahead and use that Q&A chat window there to submit any questions you have, and then I'll answer as many as we can going along. Sometimes they come in so fast and furious, it takes a while. So please be patient, or I'll pop them over to Anna or Seth, who might have a go with them live. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Seth Lacey, a principal adversary hunter at Dragos. Seth, can you introduce yourself?
So, hey guys, as Sergio mentioned, I'm a principal adversary hunter on the Dragos intelligence team. My focus is hunting innovative adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures to inform the defense of operational technology networks within industrial infrastructure. I also maintain certifications as an offensive security certified professional and a GAC certified penetration tester.
Oh, awesome, Seth. And Seth is amazing here at Dragos, as all of our adversary hunters are, really working to understand and uncover all of the threats. And with that, another amazing member of our team that I'm super proud to have here with us, Anna. Would you please introduce yourself, Anna?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today. Like Sergio mentioned, I am a senior intelligence analyst here at Dragos, so I'm constantly looking for interesting patterns and adversary threat behaviors, looking at the way that the geopolitical climate is shaping the threat landscape for OT and ICS more generally, and really looking for what we can do and what mitigations we can come up with to stop not only our big adversary groups, but our ransomware groups as well.
Oh, awesome, Anna. And a special shout out to Anna's parents, who I believe are also on the webinar today. So, hey, Anna's parents, thanks for letting us have her. She's amazing, by the way, super proud. She's outstanding. So, so with that, a couple of notes to start off with is that we've been doing this for 5 years, which is, it feels weird for 5 years. And so when we first started, the questions were, there's been talk and chatter and, about attacks against critical infrastructure, attacks against industrial infrastructure. There were books written about taking down power grids and, water systems and, harming food production and oil pipelines and all this stuff, for 15, 20 years before then. And so the question came down to us when we started Dragos and we were really digging into the threat was, well, how much of this is actually out there? Nobody actually knew. Nobody was pulling together all of the data and trying to actually answer the question, well, everyone's saying there's a problem, but how much of a problem is it? How big of a problem is it? And more importantly, how is this problem changing? Because you know what? We have enough cybersecurity problems in the world. We don't need to be chasing hypothetical problems. And so the answer for us at Dragos was, you know what? We don't want all of these industrial owners and operators who run food manufacturing plants and, who build, and keep water clean, run treatment plants and oil and gas distribution and petrochemical refining facilities and stuff. We don't need them worried about the stuff that they shouldn't be worried about. They got more than enough on their plate. So let's get an accurate picture of what's going on and then help them throughout the years understand what can be done. So that's what we've done. And I'm super excited to be introducing Seth and Anna as they hopefully walk through for you and help you understand what we've understood, which is a very radically important and critical changing industrial cybersecurity landscape. So with that, let me hand it over to Seth and Anna.
All right, thank you, Sergio. So starting out, threat activity growth this year. Sergio mentioned we've been at this for about 5 years now. And over that time period, we've observed a steady growth in threat activity across the board. This year was consistent in terms of new activity groups identified. When you combine that with the fact that many of the previously identified activity groups remain active, it's fair to say that threat activity is decidedly increasing. One item of interest, an interesting trend to note from the 3 new groups identified this year, is that 2 of them, Costabite and Erthrite, have already been observed at stage 2 of the ICS kill chain. While they're focused primarily on access operations and data theft over disruption, this is just another clear indicator that threat activity across the board is accelerating, not only in terms of the number of identified activity groups, but also their sophistication, understanding, and penetration of operational technology networks. Our focus here at Dragos is primarily behaviors, TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, as opposed to simply indicators. While indicators are nice to have in the moment, focusing solely on those indicators makes it really difficult to get in front of threats. So over the course of the rest of this presentation, we're really going to be focusing on adversary behaviors that we've observed. So the first activity group newly discovered this year that I'd like to cover is Costabite. From my perspective, this is one of our more interesting new activity groups this year. They're highly sophisticated, disciplined, and focused. The adversary is targeting predominantly renewable energy, and the adversary's behavior in this case is consistent with pre-positioning for later effects, as opposed to simply intelligence gathering. It's important to note that it's impossible to assess intent, but their actions within operational technology networks, the locations that they've been observed, lead us to assess that these locations are less useful from an intelligence gathering perspective and much more useful from pre-positioning for later effects. This adversary has used a number of zero-day exploits for initial access, particularly in VPN appliances. In many cases, this has been Ivanti Connect Secure, which was formerly known as Pulse Secure. This adversary uses dedicated operational relay boxes for individual targets, many of which are compromised small office, home office, QNAP, network attached storage devices. So this further decreases the utility of related indicators, kind of looping back to what I opened up with. Since you're using dedicated infrastructure, the indicators are unique to individual targets or a small subset of targets. Once inside the network, this adversary is dedicated to employing only living off the land techniques. This is otherwise known as using organic infrastructure. So they're not importing tooling into the network. And so this is yet one more place where an opportunity for detection that importation of tooling is taken away. And they're leveraging mainly stolen credentials to move laterally. So in my mind, Costabite is a great illustration of why we advocate for defense in depth and for monitoring for TTPs that are consistent with lateral movement and post-exploitation. In the current environment, focusing solely on the perimeter of your network can introduce a single point of failure. Highly motivated adversaries are going to find a way into your network, even if it requires deploying a 0-day, as we've observed with this adversary. So in short, if you're not monitoring for the TTPs utilized by adversaries after they've made it past the point of initial exploitation, and you're not adopting a mindset of assumed compromise, you're going to have difficulty defending from a threat with this level of sophistication and this dedication to avoiding detection by utilizing some of those living off the land techniques and then reusing credentials. So some of the takeaways in this case are utilize network segmentation. This is something that we come back to a lot all the time, and that's because it is a best practice and it does work. Implement least privileges and user access control practices to prevent adversary lateral movement. Separating your IT and OT Active Directory instances is another great step you can take to defend against some of the tactics we've observed with this adversary. You're going to want to ensure visibility and monitoring of your east-west traffic in industrial control systems locations to identify assets and connection details. You're then going to want to monitor this for abnormal connectivity between devices, particularly across network segments. Next AG identified this year that I'd like to talk about today is Petrobite. So Dragos Intelligence has observed Petrobite targeting mining and energy operations in Kazakhstan from 2019 through to 2021. This adversary has only reached stage 1 of the ICS kill chain, but so far overlaps with other AGs, activity groups, and consistent capability development suggests and indicates that they may be developing the capacity for more targeted OT-focused incidents beyond reconnaissance and collection. Petrobite utilizes a variant of the ZebraC backdoor, which some of you may already be familiar with, and they have some limited technical overlaps, specifically C2 overlaps with infrastructure used by Costabite, another activity group we track for their gray energy malware. Initial compromise for Petrobite is generally achieved with target-specific spear phishing documents that deliver ZebraC. The adversary tends to use compromised legitimate infrastructure for C2 and appears to target infrastructure with exposed WordPress vulnerabilities that allow for remote code execution. Dragos assesses with high confidence that Petrobite will continue to target mining and energy operations and is monitoring for any updates to Petrobite's TTPs and victimology. Some takeaways from my perspective with regards to Petrobite. The spear phishing documents used in a lot of the Petrobite campaigns were highly customized to their targets. So in this case, user training to defend against phishing is really important, but it's never going to deny this tactic 100% of the time, particularly with as customized and targeted as the documents were in the campaigns we've observed by Petrobite. So again, it kind of comes back to, if you can quickly identify the adversary's initial post-exploitation tactics, techniques, and procedures, you're going to be best positioned to limit the potential damage or impact from that initial compromise. The third group I'd like to talk about today that we identified this year is Erthrite. Erthrite has been active since at least spring of 2020. They have demonstrated, again, stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain, and they are truly prolific in their targeting. Dragos Intelligence has observed Erthrite compromise the operational technology environment of a Fortune 500 company, the IT network of a large electrical utility, food and beverage companies, auto manufacturers, IT service providers, and multiple oil and natural gas firms. So this adversary definitely gets points for scale and ambition. Erthrite has some technical overlaps to a group multiple IT security organizations have labeled Solar Marker. Erthrite relies heavily on search engine optimization poisoning as an initial infection vector and subsequently deploys credential stealing malware. This is a particular risk for victims with common authentication systems or credentials that are reused across IT and OT environments, which, as an aside, is something that we've observed at Dragos all too often in ICS incident response investigations. Erthrite also maintains a rapid development cycle that appears to be targeted at evading any kind of endpoint detection solution. So they're churning code really quickly, again, seeing less and less utility out of those indicators and some of the endpoint solutions. Erthrite's most recent social SEO campaign was two-pronged and began with the upload of specially crafted PDFs to otherwise legitimate sites, which in turn linked to the malware delivery sites. Erthrite appeared to leverage unprotected, formidable forms-based contact pages for arbitrary file upload of the PDFs to the legitimate sites and lace the PDFs with keywords that were, again, optimized for the search engine crawlers to push these PDFs to the top of the result lists. Dragos assesses with moderate confidence that Erthrite will continue to compromise and steal credentials and data from organizations, leaving OT environments vulnerable to further exploitation by Erthrite, or if those credentials are sold on to other adversaries. So I think for me, some of the takeaways here that some initial infection vectors are rather unexpected. And some adversaries are dedicated to constantly modifying their code base to avoid endpoint detection and response solutions. So in those cases as well, a focus on behaviors within the network, as opposed to simply indicators of compromise, can again help network defenders keep pace with highly motivated and evasive adversaries. So at this point, I'm going to step over and go into some of the updates to the existing AGs. You know, I mentioned at the top of the presentation that in addition to the new AGs we've seen this year, some of the existing ones are still very much active. So I'm just going to run through that here real quickly. So the first one I want to talk about is Stibnite. So Stibnite has continued its targeting of energy entities in Azerbaijan. Dragos observed a February 2021 campaign targeting Azerbaijani-speaking industrial experts and researchers with an updated version of their PoetRat written in .NET. Dragos subsequently observed a separate March 2021 effort by Stibnite to target the Azerbaijani Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources with a spear phishing email themed to appear like it was coming from the state oil company of the Azerbaijan Republic. They then used a macro to drop a newer version of PoetRat written in Python. So in both of these cases, Stibnite operators relied on spear phishing as an initial infection vector. Stibnite continued to use scheduled tasks as a persistence mechanism, which is something we see on a pretty regular basis. Next activity group I'd like to touch on is Wassenite. So Dragos originally identified Wassenite in 2019 during a review of the compromise of the Kudankulam nuclear power plant in India. There were some limited technical overlaps to a cluster of activity tracked by other organizations as Kinsuki. In July of 2021, we observed Wassenite deploying a variant of the Appleseed backdoor, which was a variation from the adversary's prior use of customized versions of DTrack malware in their operations. It's too early to say whether this represents a permanent shift for Wassenite away from DTrack into Appleseed, but that would be consistent with some of the activity observed by other organizations with Kimsuki. Wassenite continues to demonstrate the capacity to customize their malware for specific environments, be that target-specific internal software or to proxy traffic across non-routable internal network segments. Dragos assesses that Wassenite will continue to target ICS entities in electric generation, nuclear energy, manufacturing, and space-centric research sectors with their demonstrated intent and capabilities, and often with subsequent access sufficient to execute follow-on attacks should they make that decision. The last activity group that's been previously reported that I'd like to touch on is Camosite. So Dragos observed 2 new variants of Camosite's gray energy malware in the wild this year. That was in March 2021 and then again in August 2021. These observations continued Camosite's long-running, since around 2014, targeting of industrial infrastructure and OT networks. Camosite has technical overlaps to the group tracked by some organizations as Sandworm. Dragos assesses that Camosite is continuing to develop gray energy and that ICS components could be added to gray energy in a similar manner to that observed with prior black energy variants. Dragos continues to assess Camosite is responsible for enabling access for groups such as Electrum, another AG we track, which are then responsible for ICS disruption. Camosite continues to demonstrate interest in OT networks and ICS verticals, and asset owners should view all gray energy components as possible enabling mechanisms for an ICS-focused attack. And as an aside, we've continued to observe Camosite behavior through the beginning of this year, so we anticipate that they are going nowhere. So next up, I want to step through some notable events in 2021. There were several notable ICS-related events in 2021. I'm going to cover the attack on the Oldsmar water system prior to handing it over to my colleague Anna to talk through the steady increase in ransomware incidents that are impacting operational technology and just the overall increasing threat of ransomware to OT environments. So the Oldsmar event. The attack on Oldsmar's water system in February of 2021 should really be viewed as an important event for the OT security community. I think cyber attack is a term that is often thrown around, perhaps a bit too liberally, but in this case, it's really an accurate description. So an adversary compromised the Oldsmar OT network and manipulated HMI controls to increase sodium hydroxide levels in a way that would have resulted in civilian injuries if it hadn't been caught, definitely to dangerous levels. Fortunately, the modifications were noticed by an operator and reversed in a timely manner. It's important to note that additional secondary pH monitoring and safeguards may also have prevented harm in this case. So I think in some ways this incident was the story of 2021. The HMI manipulated by the adversary was running TeamViewer for remote access, which the adversary was able to compromise. Historically, particularly in smaller resource-limited organizations, remote access is sometimes viewed as a necessity, just based on manpower constraints, the difficulty of accessing remote sites, and those kinds of issues. I will say, though, that this trend was definitely accelerated across organizations of all sizes during the COVID pandemic. Some takeaways from this incident: always avoiding remote access where possible. Where unavoidable, don't reuse credentials and consider implementing multi-factor authentication if it's feasible. Secondary safeguards, especially physical ones, are also critical for safety-related processes and systems. This incident and some others that took place across 2021 led CISA to release a joint alert with FBI, EPA, and NSA in October of 2021, specifically on the cyber threat to water and wastewater systems. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to run through some ransomware case studies and take kind of a deep dive on the increasing impact of ransomware on operational technology environments.
Awesome, thank you, Seth. So I'm going to go over 3 different case studies of different ransomware attacks that happened in 2021. If I ever say this year, just know that I'm talking about 2021. And I think each of them highlights a very different and very important lesson for OT operators. So I'm going to start each one with a little bit of a bottom line up front, and then I'm going to walk through each of them in a little bit more detail, share some of the unique insights that we were able to find, and then eventually I'm going to move on to some data that we collected that really provides some interesting insights into what ransomware operators were up to in 2021, especially when it comes to targeting ICS companies. So starting off just with JBS Foods, most of the people on this call have probably heard about the ransomware attack about JBS Foods. Ultimately, this attack demonstrated a longer dwell time by adversaries on systems that they can leverage to exfiltrate information without raising red flags. So in 2021, we saw an increase of ransomware groups exfiltrating data prior to locking down systems and then threatening to leak this data to then encourage the payment of the ransom. And that's exactly what we saw here. What made this case really interesting was that the adversary was on the network for months, exfiltrating data in groups and clumps before they went ahead and encrypted the IT systems. So the first batch of data was uploaded on March 4th and 5th. We don't have any visibility into how long the adversaries may have been on the systems of JBS before that, but they leveraged Arclone, which is an open source tool, to upload the data to Mega, which is a file storage service that is used fairly frequently by ransomware actors to essentially stage data while it waits for a potential ransom payment. They tested the connections on the 4th and the 5th. On the 7th, they started with their first large upload of data. They did another upload of data on April 9th, and on May 30th, they did their final upload of data, and then they locked down the IT systems. And when I say that they're uploading data, I'm not talking about like 1 or 2 gigabytes of information. This was 40 to 60 gigabytes of information that we were able to observe while going through telemetry collected during this time. So ultimately, JBS ended up paying the $11 million ransom to REvil or Revel, or however you'd like to pronounce it, just to prevent further issues with their systems. But there wasn't a huge impact to this, except that they ended up shutting down a ton of their plants, including 1 of their pork processing plants and 9 of their beef processing plants in the US. So with JBS being one of the biggest meat processing plants in the US, or companies in the world, and I think that one of the biggest providers to the US as well, it's easy to see how this type of ransomware attack, should it shut down OT systems, or could really have a significant impact on our global food supply. It's also interesting to note this slow exfiltration of data over a number of months. And so ultimately, the best recommendation here is just enabling and testing your DLP, or data loss prevention technologies, and then monitoring for anomalous outbound data flow. So ultimately, if you can detect that an adversary is exfiltrating information from your company, you can potentially disrupt the encryption phase before it's in full effect. So next slide, if you will, Seth. So Colonial Pipeline, we're all familiar with it. We've all heard a lot about it. So I just want to bring it up because I do think it's really important. And the bottom line up front here is that with OT digital transformation, connectivity from IT to OT is becoming more common for most ICS asset owners and operators, and it's making visibility into your network, both IT and OT, and where they connect, even more important. So we all remember this. In May of this year, Colonial Pipeline, which provides 55% of fuel to the East Coast, shut down due to a ransomware attack. And initially, there was a lot of confusion. Was ransomware is on the pipe, was it directly affecting the OT on the pipeline? Was it just on the IT side? And with the long lines and sort of civilian panic that this ransomware attack ended up cultivating, it really brought ransomware, and especially OT focused ransomware, ICS focused ransomware, into the public eye. So this ransomware attack in itself was not fully unique. As far as ransomware attacks goes, it was system access through likely a phishing email paired with a lack of multi-factor authentication. Then there was lateral movement and escalation by the ransomware actors and exfiltration of data, followed by the eventual lockdown of the IT systems. Of course, what's different with this situation is that the operators preemptively shut down the OT systems to prevent the costly spread of ransomware onto those OT systems. And that resulted in physical impact, even though the ransomware itself wasn't on the OT systems. You might have read in the news, they did pay the ransom. It was $4.4 million. And then later, about 2.3 of that was later recovered. And one thing I'd like to note that it really relates to JBS as well as Colonial is when threat actors are able to exfiltrate data from your network, even if it's just on the IT side, it does have a big impact, potential impact on the ability of threat actors to target your OT in the future, because it's setting the exfiltration of sensitive data, including like schematics of your OT or how certain systems work, is really setting up whoever buys or eventually gets access to that data for an attack directly against your OT systems. So, of course, recommendations for this are pretty standard for any ransomware impact. Utilize network segmentation, least privileges, user access control. Try to prevent that lateral movement by the adversary and eventual deployment of ransomware. And then ensure that your critical systems and your data are regularly backed up. It's something that is really easy to say and sometimes a lot harder to do, but it's so important to keeping your yourself, your company, your firm safe from the threat of ransomware. All right, next slide, Seth. So this, I think, is really interesting. Personally, this is probably the one that I thought was the most interesting out of all three case studies, because it shows a new approach being taken by ransomware operators. So the bottom line here is that more sophisticated ransomware groups are starting to pick what are seasonally relevant targets that may not be obvious targets to the general public, but they increase the potential of a ransom payment due to the specific seasonal importance of what that industry does. So we saw this happen a few times in 2021, but one of the ones that really stood out was the targeting of agricultural co-ops in the American Midwest during the harvest season in the fall of 2021. So just for perspective, in this previous season, farmers were expected to harvest nearly 2.5 billion bushels of corn and 591 million bushels of soybeans. So this is a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans. The first attack happened in mid-September. It was against with a company or a co-op called New Co-op. It was during the peak of the corn harvest. And so once again, they're trying to harvest 2.5 billion bushels of corn. All of a sudden, there's ransomware on your system. They demanded a $5.9 million ransom payment. And a month after the attack, the company was still feeling the impacts of the attack. They said that only half of their computer systems were operational after a month of recovery. They didn't say that they had paid the ransom, but because there was no public evidence for negotiations or that the ransom had been paid, and clearly they still didn't have access to all of their systems, they most likely didn't pay the ransom. And then days later, Crystal Valley Co-op experienced an attack that was almost certainly a copycat attack. Initially becoming aware of the ransomware on September 19th, and it was initially just impacting payment systems and public-facing systems. But when you think about how businesses function, they need to be paid and receive payments. So their operations were impacted by this ransomware event because they weren't able to process the buying and selling of their product. And then the final one was Farmers Co-op Elevator, which is much smaller. The group appeared on the Lockbit dark website, but no ransom amount was ever mentioned. And to Dragos's knowledge, no data was ever leaked. So there's some suspicion around if this was more of just a scare tactic, or maybe the ransomware actors only gained access to one or two computers, so it just wasn't really worth the ransom payout from Farmers Co-op, which does happen. So if we will, there's a possibility, of course, as with any pattern, that there's some common denominator between these, maybe in the form of like a shared ISP or a shared MSP, but really, a month later when Ferrara Candy started getting targeted, a candy manufacturer, right before Halloween, it seems like these seasonally focused attacks are only going to grow most common, because a ransomware group can look at a calendar and say, what's happening in the US right now? What can we target that's going to have the biggest effect? Who cannot afford downtime right now? All right, we're going to move on, Seth, if you will, to some data. So I'm going to start with a kind of disclaimer. This data was compiled from dark web sites. It does not confirm that ransomware actors successfully compromised a firm, the extent of access that was achieved by the ransomware actors, or whether a firm actually went ahead and made the ransomware payment. This occasionally ransomware actors will actually post inaccurate information on dark websites. It might be accidental, or it might be a strategy to try to confuse victims. And in some more rarer cases, ransomware actors will attempt to appear to have compromised the victim by cross-posting documents identified as part of a different ransomware breach. So that was the case in the fall of 2021, when ransomware threat actors compromised Vestas, took information from Vestas that related to Schneider Electric and tried to make a new posting saying that Schneider Electric was compromised. That was never confirmed, and it really looked like the information had just been cherry-picked out of Vestas and slapped into a new listing for Schneider Electric. So while these websites are not fully accurate, and they shouldn't be used as such, which is why we don't generally name and shame victims, they provide unique insight into the priorities of ransomware groups, including what sectors and subsectors they most frequently target, what they're prioritizing, and what areas of the globe are more likely to experience this attack. So with all of this considered, my next few slides are just going to be going over the results of the data that we collected from June 1st to December 31st of 2021. So first of all, world map. What we're looking at here is essentially just acknowledging that ransomware is not a US-centric problem, and it's not even a Western-centric problem. While the bulk of ransomware victim postings were victims within the United States, we saw victims all over the world, from major victims, potential victims in Australia, India, tons in Germany, a lot in Italy, really and truly all over the world. And I think we're just going to continue to see that proliferation of ransomware across the globe. Next slide, please, Seth. So this is one of my favorite slides, but it's a lot of data. So we're just going to start on the left and kind of move our way over to the right. So when we look at these nice big circles here, manufacturing is the ICS sector with the highest number of victim postings by far. So out of 325 ICS victim postings that were tracked by Dragos from June 1 to December 31st, 211 of them were manufacturing, which is about 65%. One thing that's interesting about this is this data actually matches quarter over quarter. So if we look at Q3 and Q4, manufacturing stays at almost exactly 65% of victims. Food and beverage is second at 35 victim postings, or about 11%. Transportation has 27 postings, or about 8%. And then from there, we go down the line with energy, pharmaceuticals, chemical, and so on and so forth. So as we move a little bit further to the left or to the right, and look at manufacturing, it gets even more interesting. So metal products is quite a big category and includes everything from springs to bolts to components that go into vacuum cleaners, but it's far and away the biggest victim subsector, with 17.5% of manufacturing victims falling into this category. The list moves on pretty smoothly after that, but just a couple things to pull out that are interesting because they tie back into the geography of the victims. When we look at technology manufacturing, all of the victims that we tracked for technology manufacturing were either in Taiwan, the US, or China, which matches pretty closely to where technology is manufactured, which I think that one-to-one comparison is pretty interesting. And something similar happened with automotive, not as directly, but we saw that there was a significant amount of automotive victims in the United States, Germany, Sweden, and Japan. So once again, really where those industries are key in their respective geographies is where we saw them being targeted. You might be wondering why manufacturing is such a huge category. Dragos research has shown us that about 90% of manufacturing companies have limited visibility into their network. So unfortunately, the manufacturing sector is often the least mature in their OT security defenses. It's also worth noting that a lot of these victims were small or medium-sized companies that don't have the resources to invest in IT security, much less investing in OT security. So a lot of opportunity in the manufacturing sector for improvement. And if you are in the manufacturing sector, I would do, we have on the Dragos portal, if you're a Dragos customer, we have a huge list of manufacturing recommendations. Taking as many of those for ransomware, taking as many of those into account as you can is really key. Next slide. So this slide really digs into who's behind it, right? Who are the groups that are causing all this damage? And I think it's really, to me, I really like this graphic because it just demonstrates the absolute dominance of two ransomware strains, and that's of course Lockbit 2.0 and Conti. And together, just the two of those accounted for 51% of total victim postings, and then combined 70% of their total malicious activity targeted manufacturing. So a couple other things to pull out of here. Individual group activity spiked month to month. So for example, Grief posted 7 of their 13 Q4 ICS victims in October, 1 in November, and then 5 in December. So it was a big push in October and December. And notably, all but one Grief victim posting were victims in the manufacturing sector. Another one that I thought was quite interesting to pull out is PYSA. PYSA activity spiked highly in November with 11 victim postings across sectors, including oil and gas, food and beverage, and transportation. Dragos observed 13 PYSA victim postings during this time frame, which was just an absolute astronomical difference. You can see here that there's only a total of barely more than 13 postings by PYSA for the whole year. So it shows, or for the whole 7 months. So it shows you how aggressive they were in November. And what's also interesting is that, of course, it wasn't just targeting ICS, it was targeting everything that we don't track, retail, so on and so forth. And they had so many victims in November that they actually rivaled Conti's numbers for that month. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide, Seth. So I'm going to go in a little bit now into Lockbit 2.0 and Conti. So like I said, these were the two big players in the game, and both of them operate on a ransomware as a service model. So for those who aren't familiar with ransomware as a service, ransomware developers will sit wherever they sit, and they will actually write the ransomware, the malicious malware, or I guess that doesn't make sense, but the malware that goes into the ransomware package. They go out and they sell it on the dark web to what are known as affiliates. affiliates don't have to have the technical knowledge to go in and actually write the ransomware themselves. It's already been written. They just have to deploy it. And sometimes the barrier to entry is lowered even further because the affiliates are able to just purchase access from access brokers that are also on the dark web. So, you know, an actor, a bad actor can compromise a business, come and say, hey, I'm selling access to this business for such and such amount of money. The affiliate has already purchased the ransomware or has already gotten the ransomware from the ransomware developers. All they have to do is deploy it on the already popped network, and then they get to keep 70% of the ransom if it's paid, and the actual developers get the rest, the 30%. So just looking at kind of two differences between the two groups, a lot of ransomware groups, especially those that are more sophisticated, really focus on like the customer service experience. So they want you to pay the ransom, and in a lot of circumstances that will mean being very accessible, trying to make things easy for you to pay the ransom after they encrypt your systems and threaten to leak your data. Conti is a bit of a wild child. They will sometimes not give you your files back after you've paid. They will sometimes just let them go without you paying. They will sometimes just like, it's like chaos. And that is reflected in some of their other operations as well. You know, we saw in August of 2021, Conti, a disgruntled Conti affiliate getting very upset and sending and going ahead and making the Conti playbook public. So it's definitely a bit of a rockier operation. And then of course we've seen Conti activity, very interesting Conti activity is part of the conflict in Ukraine. And we have a lot of that in the Dragos portal as well. So the difference is that Lockbit 2.0 is a much tighter ship. When they retooled in June, we saw an exponential growth in the number of attacks. So while Conti kind of started here and kind of went down and then kind of stabilized, Lockbit just skyrocketed from June, July, August, and into September. And then the number of victims they were posting stayed stable through September, October, November, and December. Next slide, Seth. So looking forward into 2022, obviously we've already seen that ransomware is not going away. And Dragos assesses with high confidence that ransomware is going to continue to disrupt OT operations, whether it's through integration of OT kill processes into ransomware strains, flatten networks, allowing for ransomware to spread into OT environments, or through precautionary shutdowns of OT environments by operators to prevent ransomware from spreading to OT systems like we saw with Colonial. Additionally, Dragos assesses with low confidence that state-sponsored adversaries may leverage ransomware to mask alternate operations, potentially including theft of intellectual property, including, like I mentioned, key OT schematic details, reconnaissance of target networks, and other stage 1 components of the ICS kill chain. And finally, we assess with moderate confidence that ransomware actors will continue to leverage extortion techniques in pursuit of ransom payments. And we assess with low confidence that these methods are going to grow in severity and intensity as threat actors deploy any available means to collect their ransom. A couple of examples that we saw in 2021 was basically ransomware actors calling customers of compromised companies and saying, just so you know, we're going to leak your data too. These extortion techniques are just going to get more and more creative and give ransomware, and with the goal of giving ransomware actors better and better chances at collecting their payments. And the other thing I want to note is that ransomware actors are going to continue to come, be dominant, and then just sort of drift away or disappear completely. And that's kind of it's, in my opinion, the wrong way to look at it, because a lot of these groups are facing significant pressure from, countries that they have targeted. They're shutting down their operations, and they're either just building back up under a different name, or they're spreading out and kind of going into, maybe a developer or two goes and joins this group, maybe a developer or two goes and joins this group. So they're just continuing to kind of go into hiding. And another thing I wanted to highlight was one of the groups we didn't talk about as much was Ragnarlocker. And the FBI has already published just this month a cyber bulletin regarding Ragnarlocker, specifically targeting critical infrastructure. So we can expect to see groups that we may have not seen as active in 2021 targeting critical infrastructure, really making that their focus in 2022. Okay, I think we're on to questions.
Great, guys. I've been holding my breath trying to keep up with the question queue, which I have now answered 30 of them. So I'm doing my best here, trying to keep up with y'all. Great questions, by the way. So let me pull a couple of questions forward then for Seth and Anna that I have not answered yet, and get their insights here. So let me pose a question. Either Seth or Anna take it. Is a shutdown? This is from Heather. Is a shutdown of operations because of incidents on the enterprise network, like the Colonial Pipeline, is that common and something we'll see more often, or is that something unique to Colonial?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take that. I think it's something that is a lot more common than we think. I think Colonial was very obvious because there was all of a sudden gas wasn't getting to where it needed to go, but with things like manufacturing, where if they aren't getting product out, there might be a storage facility or warehouse somewhere else that has backup product. You wouldn't necessarily notice that immediate material impact. So I think, Colonial was very loud. It was very aggressive. We saw it have a very immediate effect. I think a lot of organizations are probably doing similar things, getting scared and shutting down their OT networks to prevent the spread, because they ultimately estimate that the danger of just, if they have a warehouse full of extra bolts, for example, shutting down and preventing the ransomware from getting onto the OT network is going to be significantly less costly than leaving it on, having the OT get onto the ransomware get onto the OT network, and then having to extract it down the line. So I would say it's more common than just Colonial for sure.
Excellent. On that again, is how do you think ransomware? Now so everyone understands we have an anonymous question here. But the question is, how have ransomware trends for industrial sectors changed? And this person asks, since 2017. We have not been keeping the records, honestly, since 2017. So we don't have that data specifically. I'm not going to say something we don't know. But we do have some data from at least the more recent periods. So would you like, Anna or Seth, would you like to answer, how do you see as the trends have changed over the period of time that we do have data for?
Yeah, I guess I'll take this one again, and Seth, if you have anything to add. Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is an overall increase in targeting of ICS sectors by ransomware actors. They're moving ransomware actors that are looking for a high level of pay, like a high % chance of payout, are targeting critical infrastructure because they're more likely to pay out than a retailer, for example, because their operations could potentially cause significant damage to the public if they were to go down. So I would say it's hard to pinpoint sectors, like Sergio said, because we haven't been tracking it as long. I think we did see a pivot towards increased targeting of manufacturing. I think that may have been due to the initial success of attacks against manufacturing firms led to copycat attacks down the line. And when those were successful, it just kind of snowballed from there. But it's hard to say, especially going back as far as 2017, what other specific sectors would have gone up or gone down in that time in the victim number rankings.
Excellent. Seth, how about this one's actually great for you. What can you say about the noted attacks in late 2021 against LNG targets that occurred?
Yeah, so we've seen an increase in activity across the end of 2021 into 2022 from the activity groups, mainly Xenotime, and we don't really do attribution at Dragos, but we do try to put things within the global context, right? And so part of our interest in this increase in activity and part of the reason we're monitoring it closely is just how that fits into the larger geopolitical picture. And so obviously, as we get here into 2022, we are continuing to track those activities and obviously trying to keep a handle on which entities are being targeted and kind of hopefully try to derive some of the TTPs being deployed by those adversaries, particularly to stay ahead of them should the geopolitical landscape shift further.
Excellent, thank you. I have several questions here on the recent US legislation about incident reporting, industrial incident reporting to DHS. Now, I want to note that Dragos is a global company. We operate in with a lot of different companies who have a lot of different laws. Some places in the world have these laws already. So there is data around how these laws are being implemented in other industrial environments around the world. So this is not, by the way, how the US is approaching it is not novel. The interesting thing, though, is that it's never about notification or not notification laws. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter if you have a notification law. Fundamentally, it's all about how you define notification. How do you define who gets notified, what they notify, and what the thresholds of notification are. And then more importantly, what the legal ramifications and liabilities are for notifying/not notifying. Do they get indemnification if they notify? Are they then potentially liable to shareholders if they don't notify or if they notify? These are all very important questions when it comes to how these types of notification laws can affect their ability to impact and improve or potentially detract from cybersecurity. So I'm not going to address the very particular notification legislation that's being brought about in the US right now, but to say that there's a lot of ways that this could be done. So with that, thank you all very much for your time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. You started hitting us all at the end. Anyway, this is the first of 3 parts of our series. We do have a second part on vulnerabilities, which is really cool. If you didn't know, ICS vulnerabilities doubled year over year from 2020 to 2021. There's a gigantic jump in what's going on in the vulnerability space for industrial control systems. That briefing is on March 16th. We're going to dive into a lot of stuff around 0 days and impact and accuracy in ICS vulnerability reporting. And then in addition to that, we have lessons learned from the front lines, which is our services organization who does incident response and assessment. And that's on March 31st. And this is also really cool. I mean, we have teams that go out and sit on these factory floors while incidents are occurring. They pull back information and we kind of compile that. A really interesting thing is of all of the food and beverage environments that we analyzed and we were involved in from a services and response perspective in 2021, 100% of food and beverage environments were externally accessible. Now, it doesn't mean that you could just log into them, but that means that they had internet-facing devices. And this is a huge deal, especially because of COVID. Over the last 2 and 3 years, companies have had to dramatically increase the amount of remote access to industrial environments to provide maintenance and management of industrial processes. And so it has caused a very dramatic effect in the cybersecurity landscape of industrial companies. So I hope you join us on March 16th and March 31st for those. And with that, I just want to give a huge thanks to Anna and Seth. We have been working on this year in review report for like 6 months, right? Since we started pulling it together, we published it. Now we have all these webinars. And we're just really excited, and all the analysts in Dragos have been, just really working hard. So thank you, Anna and Seth. Great job. And thank you all so much for being here. Take care.